nation of Qatar, unfortunately, has historically been a funder of terrorism at a very high level. They have to end that funding. And its extremist ideology in terms of funding.
Donald Trump continued to Bigfoot his own administration Friday when he took aim at Qatar, even as his Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was working to resolve a tense diplomatic crisis between Qatar and other Arab states in the Persian Gulf. Qatar, an American ally, is home to the largest U.S. base in the Middle East, a base that's central to the U.S. air war against ISIS. And since Monday, Saudi Arabia joined at least 4 other neighboring nations to isolate Qatar by breaking diplomatic and trade ties. After the blockade was announced, Tillerson offered to help broker a resolution to the impasse. But the very next day, Trump not only expressed support for the blockade, but also seemed to claim credit for pushing Saudi Arabia to take the action, tweeting, "During my recent trip to the Middle East, I stated that there can be no longer be funding of radical ideology. Leaders pointed to Qatar. Look! Exclamation point. And no sooner could U.S. officials rush to try and clear up the Trumpian damage than the Donald did it again. Because an hour before Trump's Friday comments calling out Qatar, Tillerson had been calling for calm and thoughtful dialogue to resolve the crisis. And joining me now, MSNBC anchor and First Look co-host Ayman Mohyeldin and Brian Klass, fellow at the London School of Economics and author of The Despots Accomplice, How the West is Aiding and Abetting the Decline of Democracy. And Ayman, I'm going to start with you because a lot of people are confused about what this dispute is about, particularly because back in May, on May 21st, Donald Trump was with the Qatari Amir, whose name is Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. And this is what he said about our relationship with Qatar. Take a listen.
We are friends. We've been friends now for a long time. And our relationship is extremely good. We have some very serious discussions right now going on. And one of the things that we will discuss is the purchase of lots of beautiful military equipment.
How did Donald Trump go from talking about selling beautiful military equipment to Qatar to then joining Saudi Arabia and isolating them and essentially calling them financiers of terrorists?
Well, essentially, it comes down to the perspectives of the Saudi Arabian and United Arab Emirates governments, which are really the driving force behind this, along with their allies in the region. And their perspective is they have a view of Qatar. They believe that it is promoting extremist ideology through media outlets, through clerics that it has in Qatar, that it is funding and financing various terrorist organizations and political movements, and believes in political Islam. All of these things are obviously regional political issues that they're concerned about. Donald Trump is obviously following suit with his close allies, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. It has more to do, I think, with their ability to persuade him and him being able to actually drive the discussion in the region.
And to persuade them in a very short time. I mean, when you say media outlets, Al Jazeera is based there.
Yeah, Al Jazeera. Their biggest concern is with Al Jazeera. There are a few other individuals that they believe are involved in inciting upheaval and unrest across the region.
And Brian, the thing that's confusing then is that was Donald Trump so influenced just by one meeting and getting a medal and touching an orb in Saudi Arabia that he completely flipped his view of a country that is an American ally? And can you explain to us how his sudden view changed? Is he just that easily influenced by the Saudis?
Well, I mean, he's a blank slate when it comes to foreign policy, especially in areas that are not making the news regularly. So, Donald Trump has not devoted a lot of brain cells to thinking about this divide between Qatar and the rest of the GCC. And that was on display because he had a sword dance and a party and touched the glowing orb, and all of a sudden he's carrying the weight of Saudi Arabia on the global stage. And that's a problem because it sends the signal that you can simply convince U.S. foreign policy to shift in a dramatic way, even if it's been carefully crafted for decades, simply if you're nice to the President of the United States on a personal level. And that's a really dangerous thing because these are carefully crafted. You don't build a base overnight. And we had on Tuesday, the same day that Trump tweeted, was the beginning of CENTCOM overseeing an assault on Raqqa, the heart of ISIS. And those planes that are being involved in bombing ISIS forces in Syria and Iraq in particular are flying out of an airbase 20 miles southwest of Doha, the Al Udeid Air Base. So he's undercutting the assault on terrorism in order to make a Twitter point about terrorism.
And the weird thing about it is, Ayman, that you now have Donald Trump's own State Department seeming to take issue with his position and try to take the opposite position without him. A couple of items. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, on Friday, calling for a resolution to the blockade. This is before Donald Trump tweeted again against Qatar. Take a listen.
We call on Qatar to be responsive to the concerns of its neighbors. Qatar has a history of supporting groups that have spanned the spectrum of political expression, from activism to violence. We call on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt to ease the blockade against Qatar.
And then you also have the acting U.S. ambassador to Qatar, whose name is Dana Shell Smith, retweeting a previous tweet with praise for Qatar for countering terrorist financing. Seems a good time to retweet this one. This is so important. I'm sharing it again. Great partnership, real progress to counter terrorist financing. And then our own military. Reuters reporting on Tuesday that the military is effusively praising this country that we are so dependent on for an airbase. What is happening here?
So behind the scenes, when you speak to officials, and I've spoken to military officials, I've spoken to diplomats, they are on a very different page than President Trump is in their assessment of Qatar. In fact, what they say very point blank is two things. One, the current ruler of Qatar over the last couple of years that he has been in power since taking the throne over from his father has really moved the country in, quote, 180-degree different direction. That is their assessment of how he is working on the issue of the problems of terrorism and what have you. The difference is there's a political vision that is different between Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. That's one factor. Another thing that American diplomats have been flagging for me is the fact that you have not only 10,000 Americans there, but you have about 15,000 American citizens that live in Qatar. And it seems from a diplomatic crisis perspective, not a good decision to alienate the fact that you have 25,000 Americans in a land that could not potentially be vulnerable to internal political crisis. So you're not walking a fine diplomatic rope, so to speak. That is something that the Secretary of State is very mindful of. He's trying to do that. You also have the Secretary of Defense, who's very heavily involved because of the operations that we were just hearing there from Brian. But these are important factors that seem to have been overlooked by the president when he just came out and made his assessments of where Qatar is and where it needs to go, completely ignoring the fact that there are American lives and American interests at stake with Qatar.
Yeah, and Brian, meanwhile, you now have the Qatar trying to get to Trump the way that everyone understands is his favorite medium, through Twitter. And I don't think, this is extraordinary. You actually have the Qatari ambassador to the U.S. appealing to the Trump administration in a series of tweets. Our policy to combat extremism has always been to replace weapons with pens, battling the hopelessness that has affected our region. We appeal to the U.S. administration to rely on their own sources and not with countries' political agendas. Brian, they're referring there to Russia, which now we are learning may have stoked this rivalry by putting out fake news, attempting to tar Qatar, and it worked.
Yeah, and this is one of the problems with Trump's foreign policy is that he's stoking foreign policy crises, he's creating them, and this one, which is actually not of his own creation, he is exacerbating quickly. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing two parallel foreign policies coming out of the United States. One from the State Department, the diplomats, the people who are seasoned and understand these issues, and one on Twitter that's from President Trump. Now, this is really dangerous because diplomatic miscommunication and contradictory foreign policy signaling can increase the likelihood of war. It can increase the likelihood of miscalculation. If you think back to the first Gulf War, the April Glaspie meeting with Saddam Hussein is often cited as one of the reasons why Saddam Hussein misinterpreted this and decided that he would invade Kuwait. So I think that when you have two contradictory foreign policy messages coming out of Washington, the likelihood of war, conflict, etc. is much greater, and that's something we should all be worried about.
Yeah, and it's not lost on anyone that this all comes after a $100 million donation to Ivanka Trump's charity, at least pledge from the Saudis, and a supposed big arms deal that Jared supposedly negotiated that turns out to have been previous deals wrapped up as a new thing. But people are noticing the relationships here. Ayman, Mohyeldin, and Brian Klass, thank you both very much. And coming up,